At dawn on April 14, 1945, Brazilian artillery opened fire on the fortified town of Montese in the northern Apennines. For 2 hours, shells hammered German defensive positions on Monte Buffone and Montello, the high ground dominating the town. At 7 a.m., 3 Brazilian infantry regiments advanced behind a rolling barrage, artillery fire moving forward at walking pace while infantry followed immediately behind it. By nightfall on April 17th, 4 days and 3 nights of continuous combat later, German forces retreated from Montese toward the Po Valley. The Brazilian flag flew over the town. 2 German defensive lines had been broken. The Gothic Line, Germany's main defensive position across northern Italy, and the Genghis Khan Line, the fallback position behind it. The breakthrough enabled Allied forces to advance toward Bologna and ultimately encircle German forces south of the Po River. The battle cost the FEB dearly. It was the bloodiest engagement Brazilian forces fought in World War II. But the strategic consequences justified the casualties. When Montese fell, the German defensive system in northern Italy collapsed. The war in Italy would end within 2 weeks. That's why Montese mattered. That's why Brazilian troops fought for 4 days in conditions that veterans would later describe as worse than Monte Castello. That's why 80 years later, the town of Montese still honors Brazilian soldiers with annual ceremonies, a museum dedicated to the FEB, and a square named Piazza Brasile, Brazil Square. Can one division break 2 defensive lines in 4 days of fighting? Can a battle determine the outcome of an entire campaign? Please like this video to see how the Brazilians did it. Subscribe for more FEB stories, and let's understand what Montese was, why it mattered, and what it cost. Montese is a commune in the province of Modena, Emilia-Romagna region, northern Italy. The town sits at approximately 900 meters altitude in the northern Apennines. In 1945, it was a small agricultural community of a few hundred people. Its strategic significance came entirely from geography. Montese controlled approaches to the Po Valley, the broad, flat plain of northern Italy that Allied commanders needed to reach to encircle German forces. The town sat on the northwestern edge of the Gothic Line, the main German defensive position stretching from the Adriatic to the Tyrrhenian Sea across the width of Italy. The Gothic Line was not improvised. German engineers had spent months in 1944 fortifying it. Concrete bunkers, machine gun positions carved into rock, artillery registered on every approach route, minefields, barbed wire. The positions at Montese were particularly strong because the terrain favored defense. 2 high points, Monte Buffone and Montello, dominated the town and surrounding valleys. German observers on these peaks could see Allied movements for kilometers. They could call artillery fire on any concentration of troops or vehicles. Taking Montese meant taking those peaks under fire from prepared positions. The German force defending Montese in April 1945 was part of the Wehrmacht's 14th Army under General Kurt von Tippelskirch. These were not the elite formations Germany had fielded in 1939 to 1941. By spring 1945, German units in Italy were under strength, poorly supplied, and composed largely of older soldiers, teenagers, or troops recovering from wounds suffered on other fronts. But they were defending from prepared positions in mountains, and defensive warfare requires less manpower and training than offensive warfare. A company of soldiers in bunkers could hold off a battalion attacking uphill under fire. The Germans knew this. They intended to hold Montese as long as possible to delay the Allied Spring Offensive. The Allied Spring Offensive, codenamed Operation Grapeshot, began on April 6, 1945, in the British 8th Army sector on the Adriatic coast. The plan called for coordinated attacks across multiple sectors to prevent German forces from reinforcing threatened areas. The British would attack in the east. The U.S. Fifth Army, including the FEB, would attack in the Central Apennines. If both offensives succeeded, German forces would be forced to retreat or be encircled. But the offensive wasn't going as planned. British forces had encountered stronger resistance than expected. Progress was slow. The U.S. Fifth Army needed to break through quickly to prevent German forces from consolidating. That meant Montese had to fall. The FEB was given the mission. General Mascarenhas de Moraes, commanding the Brazilian division, understood what this meant. Montese would be the hardest fight the FEB had faced. Monte Castello in February had been difficult. Montese would be worse, but the strategic situation demanded it. Mascarenhas committed his entire division. The attack plan was methodical. Brazilian artillery would conduct a 2-hour preparatory bombardment starting at dawn on April 14th. The bombardment would suppress German defensive fire and destroy obstacles. Then 3 infantry regiments would advance in a rolling barrage. Artillery fire moving forward continuously at a pace infantry could follow. This tactic, developed on World War I's Western Front and refined through years of combat, allowed attacking infantry to reach enemy positions before defenders could recover from the shelling. It required perfect coordination between artillery and infantry. If the artillery moved too fast, infantry would be left behind and slaughtered by enemy fire. If artillery moved too slow, defenders would have time to recover and the advantage would be lost. At 5 a.m. on April 14, 1945, Brazilian artillery began firing. For 2 hours, shells fell on Monte Buffone, Montello, and German positions around Montese. The barrage was perfect according to post-battle reports from both Brazilian and German sources. German bunkers that had been considered shell-proof were hit repeatedly. Communication trenches collapsed. Minefields were detonated by artillery fire. When the barrage shifted forward at 7 a.m., German defenders were suppressed, disoriented, and in some cases buried alive in collapsed positions. The 3 Brazilian infantry regiments advanced. The 1st Infantry Regiment Sampaio, the 6th Infantry Regiment Ipiranga, and the 11th Infantry Regiment Tiradentes. Each regiment had specific objectives. The Sampaio Regiment would take Monte Buffone. The Ipiranga Regiment would take Montello. The Tiradentes Regiment would secure the town of Montese itself once the high ground was secured. Armor from the U.S. 1st Armored Division, M4 Sherman tanks, would support the infantry where terrain permitted. Engineers would clear mines and obstacles. The advance was brutal. Even with artillery support, attacking uphill against prepared defenses meant exposure to machine gun fire, mortar fire, and whatever artillery the Germans could still bring to bear. Brazilian soldiers advanced through snow and mud. It was mid-April, but at 900 meters altitude in the Apennines, winter conditions persisted. Visibility was limited by morning fog. German defenders who survived the artillery barrage fired from bunkers and foxholes. The fighting was close quarters, grenades, rifles, bayonets. By noon on April 14th, Brazilian troops had reached the lower slopes of Monte Buffone and Montello, but were engaged in intense combat for every meter. The Germans counterattacked. This was standard defensive doctrine. When attackers penetrate your lines, counterattack immediately before they can consolidate. German infantry, supported by whatever armor they could spare, struck Brazilian positions on Monte Buffone in the early afternoon of April 14th. The fighting became hand-to-hand. Brazilian troops held. The counterattack was repulsed. But it demonstrated that German forces were still capable of organized resistance despite the artillery barrage. Fighting continued through the night. Night combat in mountains is disorienting and terrifying. Soldiers couldn't see more than a few meters. Every sound suggested enemy movement. Sentries fired at shadows. Orders were passed by runners because radios were unreliable. Wounded men who couldn't be evacuated in darkness stayed in foxholes until morning. The cold was severe enough that some wounded soldiers developed hypothermia and died from exposure rather than their wounds. April 15th brought continued attacks. Brazilian infantry pushed toward the summits of Monte Buffone and Montello. German resistance was fierce, but increasingly fragmented. The artillery barrage had destroyed German communication lines, preventing coordinated defense. German units fought independently, each defending its own position without support from adjacent units. This made them vulnerable to being surrounded and eliminated piecemeal. By evening on April 15th, Brazilian forces controlled most of Monte Buffone. April 16th saw the capture of Montello and the beginning of street fighting in Montese itself. Street fighting is the most difficult type of urban combat. Defenders have every advantage. They know the terrain. They can prepare ambushes. They can fortify buildings. Attackers must clear each building room by room, exposing themselves to fire from multiple directions. Brazilian infantry entered Montese and began the methodical process of clearing it. Grenades thrown through windows, small arms fire into rooms before entering. Close quarters combat in hallways and staircases. The fighting was slow, exhausting, and deadly. By the night of April 17th, German forces realized Montese was lost. They'd fought for 4 days and inflicted significant casualties, but Brazilian pressure was relentless. Staying in Montese meant being encircled. The German commander ordered withdrawal during the night of April 17th and 18th. German troops retreated north toward the Po Valley, abandoning their positions. By dawn on April 18th, Montese was clear. The battle was over. The cost was severe. Brazilian casualties for the Battle of Montese: 426 killed, wounded, or missing over 4 days of fighting. This was the highest casualty count for any single FEB engagement. German casualties aren't precisely recorded, but post-battle assessments suggest approximately 500-700 killed, wounded, or captured. The physical destruction of Montese was extensive. Buildings were damaged or destroyed by artillery and street fighting. Civilians had evacuated before the battle began, but their homes and livelihoods were gone. But the strategic consequences justified the cost. The fall of Montese broke both the Gothic Line and the Genghis Khan line simultaneously. German forces south of the Po River could no longer maintain a coherent defensive position. They retreated north, but Allied forces, reinforced by the breakthrough at Montese, advanced faster than they could retreat. The encirclement was beginning. By April 21st, Bologna fell to Allied forces, including Polish II Corps. By April 29th, the FEB accepted the surrender of 3 German divisions totaling 14,779 men near Fornovo di Taro. By May 2nd, all German forces in Italy surrendered. The conquest of Montese is significant because it enabled this entire sequence. Without Montese, the Gothic Line holds. Without breaking the Gothic Line, Allied forces don't reach the Po Valley. Without reaching the Po Valley, the encirclement doesn't happen. The chain of causation runs directly from Montese to Germany's surrender in Italy. Today, Montese honors Brazilian soldiers who liberated the town. Piazza Brasile, Brazil Square, sits in the town center. A memorial lists the names of Brazilian soldiers killed in the battle. The Historical Museum of the Territory in Montese's medieval fortress contains an extensive section dedicated to the FEB, including uniforms, weapons, photographs, and personal items from Brazilian soldiers. The Museum Memory d'Italia in nearby Iola holds over 4,000 original exhibits documenting the Gothic Line campaign with significant focus on Brazilian contributions. Every year on April 14th, Montese holds ceremonies commemorating the battle. Brazilian veterans attended these ceremonies for decades after the war. Italian children learned the Brazilian national anthem and sang it at commemorative events. Brazilian and Italian flags fly together. The gratitude is genuine and lasting. Montese understands that its liberation came at the cost of Brazilian lives. The town has never forgotten. That's the story of Montese and April 14th, 17th, 1945. 4 days of combat that broke 2 defensive lines, cost 426 Brazilian casualties, and enabled the final Allied offensive that ended the war in Italy. That's the story of why they called it the Bloodiest Day. That's the story of a town that still remembers. If this story reminds you that some battles determine campaigns, that strategic victory requires tactical sacrifice, and that gratitude can last generations, Hit that like button. Subscribe for more FEB stories. The Smoking Snakes have more to tell. Turn on notifications. Comment where you're watching from. We read everyone. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.